Yeah, very good at it. But I'm excited to hear about this. What is it?
Let's hear about this witnesses. Yeah, Justin, why don't you tell us about we want to still man these arguments. It's like, what is the strongest arguments for and against the witnesses?
Well, I think foremost, I'll kind of walk through how Jeremy Reynolds frames it, and then I'll try to provide some counter arguments, but you guys hop in whenever. Right. But let me just kind of give the framing of the skeleton of his thing about the witnesses.
And I didn't really know anything besides like, hey, you opened up the Book of Mormon and it says like the testimony of 3 witnesses. You flip the next page, like testimony of the 8 witnesses. That's like all I knew before actually reading the CES letter. So I actually don't know a lot on this issue. I think the CES letter did a really good job of like saying, hey, this is like, there's way more to this than you would have thought.
Yeah, for sure. So he kind of, as I mentioned at the beginning, he starts off saying with basically a head note argument, just saying, well, why does it matter if there's any witnesses in the first place if it wasn't a literal translation, right? And then we got into that whole rabbit hole if it matters. But that's kind of how he starts it. And then I classify, he has a couple of different sections, I would say. One of them is like questioning the sanity of those people back then based on their worldview that they held. So that's the first one. I'll come back to it.
So is this okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll dig into it in a second. The second one is kind of saying, okay, even if you're okay with their worldview, they're fishy. Their credibility is up for question. Okay, so that's like the second one that he kind of tries to attack. The third one is, okay, accepting all those things, what they witnessed and what they wrote down and how they spoke, there's a lot of semantic differences in how we would understand those same words. And then the next one, the fourth one, is presenting counter examples that faithful members of the church obviously wouldn't believe, but they seem to parallel these, the Joseph Smith witnesses and things. And then I think the last one is kind of similar to the second one about the credibility. He's just saying, well, okay, these aren't, in our sense, in our contemporary sense, the witnesses aren't concrete or solid in a legal court because the lack of things. And that's really the most simple one. So kind of starting at the question of the sanity, I think what he's hitting on is that with our contemporary understanding of witnesses, how can we trust people with magical worldviews, right? So lots of you have heard this, like Joseph Smith has a history of treasure hunting. New England people were very superstitious back then. They like to use things like divining rods, peepstones, treasure hunting. Joseph Smith and much of his family were very much into treasure hunting. And in fact, even in D&C 8, when it talks about the gift of Aaron, that was originally replaced. That was replaced. What it said originally was the rod of nature, and that's kind of referencing Oliver Cowdery's use of the divining rod, exactly.
And so that's like, is that like a rod where you can like look into the rod, kind of like the stone, and you can see like distant places? Is that what that is?
I don't think so. I think the divining rod, what they thought it was kind of like a magnetic thing, and you would I had a class where he was showing how it worked. It was something about like you'd see like liquid or like dewdrops coming out of the ground on it, and then that kind of indicated something. It was something really weird that they believed like they could use this to locate valuable things based on its natural properties or something.
Yeah. So and I think like listening to this, because this sounds crazy to us today, like that's just so superstitious, but like it was the common worldview of the time in the 19th century for at least this community of people, right?
And I think this kind of goes along, I think, with a lot of even biblical arguments, right? A lot of people can look on the Bible, and of course it seems ridiculous. And of course we could even say, you know what, atheists, you're right in laughing and ridiculing a lot of things that believers do believe. And it's because they're looking back on a medieval view of the world and how they understood it, and it's not like a material view. Right, geocentric model. Right, the flat Earth model.
And there's actually the geocentric view in the Book of Abraham, actually, like where everything's orbiting around Moses or whatever, something like that. But yeah, to your point, there's a lot.
So to my point, I think yes, like this, like looking back and then kind of saying, oh, like if I'm to give an argument against what Jeremy Reynolds is saying, like it's not so clear that people contemporaneously are very much smarter than those back then, right? And it's kind of a fallacy in itself to attack the character or the worldview that they held, because they interpreted the world in a much different manner. They weren't using it in a materialist scientific worldview that many of us hold today, and it's kind of the prevailing view. So I mean, Farms and Fair Mormon, I think they kind of just say, oh, that's like an ad hominem attack.
So
What
they
are
would
your
say,
guys'
hey,
comments?
so I would guess that they would say that, hey, you know, they had crazy ideas back then, but that's uncorrelated with the divine nature of the production of the Book of Mormon, let's say. I would guess is their argument, right? And then,
Yeah.
but like to that, I think Dan Vogel has made a persuasive argument that Joseph Smith tries to downplay his amount of treasure digging.
He does, yeah.
As far as him, I guess he's not one of the witnesses, right? I mean, he's one of the witnesses, but not one of the 11. But like, there's this kind of downplay, not just by Joseph Smith, but by the history of the church
Sure.
throughout the
And I think because they're
decades.
embarrassed about it, for
Yeah,
sure.
and they are embarrassed. But like, either you should hold the Farms view, like, hey, he had believed in all these crazy things, including like the size of your head determined like your intelligence.
Phrenology.
But yes, that's what it's called. Phrenology. I
Phrenology.
think he believed in phrenology. But like, either you own that and you're like, hey, but who cares? You know, what he produced was so inspirational that you know, today we still study it.
Phrenology is a common. It stems from Darwin. It's all part of Darwin.
There's
And
the kooky non-scientific part.
So you tell me. So should I believe Darwin or Joseph?
Okay.
Yeah,
it's
no,
unfortunate what
agree.
Darwin
if I
turned
can
into
just
there.
like comment there, I definitely agree with that. There's something very interesting with the way you could, even the people that are going to look at us in 50 years and are going to say, you know what, all this like scientism of, you know,
all this essential oils.
all you Draper moms that used essential oils.
Hey, you better be careful there. We got a lot of listeners in Draper here.
So look, it's like this. They're gonna look back at us, and there's gonna be some obvious things that are gonna change, because it's the way that they're interpreting the world is just different than the way that we interpret the world. And
So
it's
I
not
would agree with you there, but the argument here is specifically that, hey, like Joseph Smith is using these superstitious ideas in the actual production of the Book of Mormon. And to that, I would argue back and say,
give me an example.
Like, he's using the seer stones to translate. He's not using the Urim and Thummim, which most people don't. He's not using the breastplate. He's using the stone that he found a couple years before in a well when he was on a treasure digging mission. He uses that stone primarily. But I mean, to that, I would just argue back at myself and say, hey, when it says that I make the weak things of the world strong, like I will use the weakest things of this world to bring about my work. I think if you interpret that literally like extreme weaknesses, we're not just talking about like flaws here. We're talking about major problems with Joseph Smith's character. And this is going to come down to polygamy even maybe. But like, you could argue that, hey, he's just using what Joseph Smith is accustomed to in his culture. And I think that's the argument that most apologists make, right?
Right. Because that's the language of Joseph Smith. So God is going to utilize the tools that is going to be most effective for Joseph Smith to communicate that.
Yeah. So I think that's going to be the argument against, like, hey, who cares if he has a weird worldview? We have weird worldviews. He's going to have a weird one. God's just going to interact in his time. I know that sounds kind of dismissive almost, but like, I think there is some substance to that.
Yeah, and that's why he starts the chapter with that, obviously, because I don't think Jeremy Reynolds thinks that's the strong. He's just kind of, he's kind of baiting. If you're going to buy that, then you're definitely going to buy the next one, right? So, but I think, it is a valid point to bring up, and I think it's something that a lot of people do commit when they're looking back on ancient or
it drives me nuts when I see like people that are like scientists or something like that, or even like some movies. I think they said it was like 60% of Americans believe in ghosts or something like that, and it was like a bad thing, or like, you know, and so there's this like predominant scientism that just because you can't prove something doesn't mean it, or it means that it doesn't exist. And I think that this is like an erroneous way of looking at the world, because there are a lot of things that you can't prove. And so is it true that they don't exist? Does that go hand in hand? And so I think that you look back at like you know, your parents or your grandparents and things like that, and they did have different worldviews, but does that make it like less accurate?
Does
And
that
it's hard to say, because
delegitimize the work they did?
Yeah.
if you say
But
that,
Right, that's
if
the
you say
core
yes,
question.
then you cut off the branch on which you sit. So, you know, so you can't
Sure.
say, uh-huh.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think, but I think that's, I think that just thinking back on like public education that I did receive, they do like they do seek to delegitimize middle age and prior, like they were kind of
Right.
backwards, barbaric, you know. So I mean,
I think that's the wrong
there is
direction
legitimate.
to take.
I do think it's the
yeah.
wrong direction, but it actually in academia, I think that like they don't understand it maybe, but a lot of them do want to just delegitimize it because it's much more simpler to work with our
Yeah.
current.
And but if you do you make it unlegitimate, I'll say that, then you make your own opinions as well delegitimate, because you're
But that
you
kind of
know,
feels like a broad paintbrush here. Like I get
Perhaps.
your argument from a philosophical point, and I think there's a lot to be had to said. Like when Jordan Peterson takes the Bible seriously because he doesn't understand it, instead of being like hubris about it and saying, "Hey, I don't get it, so it's just wish-washy, superstitious poop," right? Like I think there's a point to be made about that. It's just I don't know if we can apply this necessarily to Joseph Smith with the seer
Yeah.
stone in the hat necessarily. Does that make sense?
yeah, okay, I gotcha.
Okay, so then and then the second one. So let's say this is what Jeremy Reynolds is saying. If you do accept that worldview, you're okay with Joseph Smith holding the magical worldview and the superstitions and stuff. There's plenty of reason to doubt the credibility of the 11 witnesses, and he kind of just goes through the 3 witnesses, because those are usually the ones that are touted the most, because
So
they didn't
David
recant.
Whitmer,
David
Martin
Whitmer,
Harris,
Martin Harris, and
Oliver
Oliver
Cowdery.
Cowdery, right?
Okay.
So these 3, I mean, I think we're usually told, and I think it's up for dispute, but it seems to be generally true that none of them recanted it, and they all testified to the veracity of the plates and the translation.
Even after leaving the church, and even at their deathbed.
Correct.
And
So he kind of goes after
multiple opportunities to correct it. They didn't correct it. They stood by their
horrible
right.
relations with Joseph Smith, you know, and still didn't deny it. Yeah.
So, I mean, he kind of goes after Harris first. He talks about how he was a little bit unstable, gullible, and superstitious. And he goes about saying, like, he changed his religion 5 times, but I think that's disputed as well. And he also had financial motivations because he was sponsoring the Book of Mormon, so obviously he wanted it to succeed. And then David Whitmer, he seems to have conveyed that it was like...
Oh, wait, are we just going to discount that? I'm sorry, I want to go back to Martin Harris.
We can go back to Martin Harris.
Okay.
Pause me whenever. I can go through it. Or
Martin Harris has got to be one of like the most interesting people, because you know, so from what I know, right, and you guys can correct me if you hear anything.
I don't know much. Go ahead.
So from what I know about Martin Harris, Joseph Smith worked for Martin Harris for a little while, and so Martin Harris knew his character. There's a lot to be read about in Revelations and Context, really good book. And so, you know, he worked with him for a little while. Martin Harris did have a lot of superstitions. Him and his wife knew the Smith family, and so his wife talked to the parents, you know, and they started telling her about what was all happening, and she got really committed. And so she said, you know, honey, come follow me, come check this out, what Joseph Smith Jr. is doing. And so then he checked it out. He didn't really want to, but his wife was really pressing him on it. So he puts some more effort. He starts like finding out about it, and then this is what, you know, we learned, that he takes the writings, the characters over to like 3 different academics, you know, and he finally takes it to, I can't remember what his name was, like Anton or something.
Charles Anton.
I think that was in Sunday school today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, we're like those Chat Jesus Morons that read the CES letter 20 minutes before going to church.
So you know, he takes it over to Charles Anson, and then he comes back, and that's like the main point. He comes back like more convinced than ever. But other than that,
Right.
he does another thing. He replaces the seer stone with another stone, and Joseph's like, wait a second, I can't translate right now. I don't know what's going on. And then Martin Harris is like, I took your stone, and gives it back. And he's more convinced
Mhm.
then as well that
Sure, sure.
his translating. And so there's definitely like more to be said than he's just like superstitious. Like he's a guy that
He's skeptical. Are you trying to
so
say
he's
he's a little bit skeptical?
skeptical at first, and then so
Totally drinks the Kool-Aid afterwards, though.
he
I'm just kidding.
he goes in
He goes all
completely-
in though. Yeah, he
he
goes,
goes
all in.
all in, and then his wife backs out.
Right.
His wife backs out.
Just gotta-
Yeah, yeah.
Start sleeping in different beds in their house, and so she's wants nothing to do with him, and his family's giving him a hard time, and he ends up taking the 116 pages, and so he's just all sorts of stress due to this. So I think we can't oversimplify.
I mean,
Sure. No,
I think
don't
that's a
mean
good
to-
argument for the sincerity of the witnesses. Because
Right,
really,
and I don't mean
really
to oversimplify and say I'm simply repeating.
I think Justin's
what
just
Jeremy
trying to
read.
present the main point.
I'm presenting you.
the strong point.
Yeah,
But
right, I'm
I-
trying to give you a strong argument for what the CES letters.
I think what we have to separate here is what do those data points tell us about, let's say, first the sincerity. So I guess that's part of the credibility, right? The sincerity of these people, but then the validity of their statements as well. Because you can be
because we're talking about
sincere
credibility.
but wrong,
So,
like
and then
sincerely wrong. Does that make sense?
there's this other point. I kind of want to get your guys' opinion on this. Well, we're talking about the three witnesses. They go into I can't remember what forest it was, or
When they're trying to get a witness to see
they,
the plate.
when they try to get the witness, and then they're like, we can't receive a witness, and Martin's like, it's me, isn't it? And like takes off, and then the other David Whitmer and Oliver Cowdery receive a witness, and then Martin Harris receives a witness
Later,
down.
right?
And so there's something to be said about that as well. Like, why didn't they just all receive a witness at the same time? Like, where's the what is the credibility in there? And so it's just not like as harmonious as we try to make it. And so I think part of that establishes some credibility, because they could very well just say, like, we all saw it at the same time, and like there's something to that. I think. I don't know what you
Sure.
Okay.
And Andre, I think
point.
I broke this down into like 5 different categories of what the CES letter is trying to do to kind of, it is an effective dismantling of people's view of this witnesses, if you may say that. But I think I do agree with you. I do think that overall, the 11 witnesses together, the sincerity, and just the general overall record, it seems to verify that this is a strong point to say that, okay, to testify to Joseph Smith's translation and the use of the gold plates. I think I would concede that.
I guess what I can't get out of, I guess, because like I get that there's a strong argument to be made here about the witnesses, like I've said like 3 times now, but I can't. Jeremy Reynolds is just so like good at rhetoric when he talks about David Whitmer being the guy who saw Jesus in the form of a deer. I can't get that image out of my head. Does that make sense? So every time David Whitmer pops up, it seems like this is the guy that thought Jesus was in the form of a deer, which isn't that crazy, because I guess God could be in the form of a donkey, and I don't know, like in the Bible, that's probably not God. I'm just bashing this.
It was an angel.
Getting this wrong. An angel stopping a donkey, but like, I don't know. There's just something really powerful about Jeremy Reynolds' like rhetorical skill in the CS letter when he's trying to discredit.
There's something to be said about that, because honestly, like, I think that if you dive deep enough, and obviously, Justin, you're going to be studying law, discrediting the witness is one of the main focuses in a case, where you want to disprove that something happened, discredit the witness,
Yeah, I think that's a great. That's, if you dig through some Reddits, you'll see immediately like, oh, would you really want a witness testifying? Like the first thing the lawyer is going to do is they're going to want to make them contradict themselves or say something that makes the jury think that they're unreliable, right? And then after that, their testimony, their witnessing is just, it's not very credible.
It's just not worth it. Yeah.
This is the tactic he's employing, and I think it's effective.
It is effective. It is effective.
In that he's saying he's attacking their credibility. So
why don't you go ahead and just list the other kind of problems? Let's say that people are.
Yeah, sure. David Whitmer. So when he describes himself witnessing the gold plates, it seems that it's impression similar how Quakers would feel the spirit move, right? And I think there was a few interviews where he talked with some people, and they weren't in the church, obviously, and they weren't convinced that he literally and physically saw the plates. And then on the other
When you
side,
say like Quakers, is this like the people bouncing around the walls and stuff and like fainting?
no, I think those are Shakers.
Oh,
Yeah,
Shaker.
those are the Shakers.
Well,
Yeah,
what do you mean by Quakers
Our
feeling the
earliest
spirit?
of Americans, the Quakers.
Like the Quaker religious group, I think when they feel
Uh-huh.
the spirit move, it's like they're not seeing it with their physical literal senses because they don't mean it that way, but
Okay.
it's like there's quote unquote spiritual eye, right? So they're experiencing this transcendently. It's not something that's literally happening, I guess,
And
scientifically.
so I was actually in Sunday school a couple of weeks ago, and they said the teacher said this. She said the 3 witnesses probably saw it more as a spiritual thing, but the 8 witnesses like definitely saw it as a physical thing. Did you
Right.
get that sense in your readings of the quotes?
In the reading of the quotes in the CES letter,
No. I think there's like not just in the CS letter. There's probably
like in
what,
the actual Book of
1 or
Mormon, like
200, a few hundred quotes of all the people ever commenting on the testimony issues. Like, did you get a sense that the 3 typically seem to be seeing it with spiritual eyes, but the 8 would use language referring to physicality? Right, because there's conflicting quotes with the 3 witnesses, but I think there's like some
yeah.
argument. There's no conflicting quotes necessarily with the 8 witnesses as far as the physicality of the plates.
I'm not sure. Do you know anything about that?
So I do know that they talk about that in Revelations. In context, they say that it was more of a museum experience for the 8 than for the 3. So the 3 had angels manifest to them, and I have to read it back again, but they were shown visions, and also it was just a very like divine experience, I guess, upper tier, definitely desirable. And then the other experience was much more like walking through a museum and touching and holding, and they held the breastplates and the and all that other jazz. So, and the sword and all that jazz. And so much more like a museum is what I read.
And do you remember, Andre, if any of the 8 ever recanted their testimony, their witness?
I don't think they did.
I'm not sure. I have to look into it.
I'm pretty sure none of them did.
Yeah.
None of the 8 or 3.
Yeah. So that's a good question.
Significant.
So I mean, the reason why that's significant because that's
some would say significant.
So the thing that's significant here is it's not a win, I guess, for Jeremy Reynolds, if there is corroborated, I guess, how would you say it, like consistent testimonies of the physicality of the plates, if they're able to describe the actual physical nature, like they all describe it as being this wide and this thick and this long, and here's how it sounds when you shake it and all that stuff. I didn't know about the sword and breastplate. But I mean, if there are consistent testimonies on that, that's why I think typically critics of the church have this as their weakest point. And this is the strongest point against them, is the consistency of the physicality of the plates. Although maybe there's no physical nature or less of a physical nature for the 3 witnesses. I would have to comment on that, though, and say that just because there were actually plates doesn't mean that they actually had the writings of the Nephites and the Lamanites, let's say. So I'll make that caveat.
Yeah, and you can get down that whole. I was digging through Reddit threads about whether or not, like, the weight of the plates, and then like the air gaps in between, and whether or not it's like 86 pounds or 105 or 220 pounds. Yeah, but you can.
One of the arguments against that, you could say, is that Joseph Smith just forged these things
out of tin, is what Dan Vogel says.
And yeah.
So
I mean, this is an interesting. It's interesting, but at the same time, there's another point. What could be for or against is that they're mostly from the Whitmer family, And so you could say
Right.
like,
Yeah,
Mark Twain said I couldn't be happier if every
if
single
there's
Whitmer had testified of it. But
he's
and
just
so
kind of trolling.
it's like
That is a
full
point he
tangent,
brings up in the letter. Yeah.
because like what is something that a family is like completely, what does a family like completely agree on? And like almost nothing, so it could be for or against.
Sure. Yeah, I think Jeremy Reynolds is more saying, most of these witnesses are relatives of Joseph Smith, like either distant or
what
close, or they had a financial incentive.
and the apologist argument for that would be, hey, you find something miraculous, who are you going to tell? You're going to tell your friends and family, right? So I've heard that argument. I think there's also another argument, like I think it was one of the Whitmers, but like the uncle or something was like extremely critical of. He was like a Calvinist, and he told everyone like, hey, this is definitely a fraud. Like, don't believe this guy. So like another data point to throw out. But
then
Sure.
can I just interact with just a fun little thing on the side, that I think it was Mary Whitmer. She was in the farm and she was milking
And she
some
said the angel
cows,
appeared
and
to
she
her,
said
and
an angel appeared to her. So just a little fun little fact off the
yeah,
side.
I thought that was always an interesting story in Sunday school as well.
okay. So I think Jeremy Reynolds though goes on to say, hey, these people are not normal people because they see Jesus in deers and stuff. Like, you shouldn't trust
Yeah,
anyone,
yeah.
right?
And I think
That kind of his argument.
another good point, something that's, I think it'll feed into the next one. Like, okay, so David Whitmer, on the one hand, he apostatized, right? But he won't recant it. He'll always say that he knows that what he saw, and he'll testify the truthfulness of it. But then on the other hand, he says that the church apostatized after Joseph Smith, right? It's not the true church. The Brighamite led church isn't actually true. So then Jeremy Reynolds is like, why do you listen to why do you selectively choose his, that, but you don't take into account his other statements and things? So that's kind of another thing that.
Oh, that's a good point.
So there's the one about the Strangeites, James Strange. Was
Yeah,
he one of? He
so
had.
that's the one I
David.
kind of categories for like counter examples. So
I
I
mean,
think
it's a good point, but against the prophet, not so much against the Book of Mormon. But
sure. The count to Brandon, what Brandon's saying, this is where Jeremy Reynolds is presenting counter examples that members obviously wouldn't want to believe, right? So there's obvious ones such as, I don't know, like such as the Strangeites. So James Strang was someone that claimed he was supposed to be the successor of after Joseph Smith passed away, and he said he had some letter, and then he translated, I think it was called the Book of Laban or something, and he also had a bunch of witnesses. I think he had 11 witnesses as well, and they all
And he had
testified
plates.
of the
He had
truthfulness.
plates,
They were
right?
plates. He actually had physical plates. He
And
showed them.
they dug it up with him. Like, he was like, hey, here's the plates, and then the witnesses dug it up.
And they never denied their testimony, right? So of course, as faithful members, we would discount that one. We wouldn't want to believe that, right? But he's saying, hey, like, look at this. He's trying to put it under your nose and say, why aren't you looking at this one? And then there's and James Strang is fascinating. I mean, go read his Wikipedia page. He had like a little kingdom set up in Wisconsin, I think, and I think there's still some Strangeites up there, but I think, yeah.
They would call themselves Mormons, right?
I think they do. They still say they're like the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day. I don't know what they call, but I've heard they read the Book of Mormon. They do everything else the same. So
interesting. Yeah.
And then there's Ann Lee and the Shakers, where there was a bunch of people in the Shaker town. I actually went to a Shaker village. My wife and I. It's here in New Hampshire. They have. I think there's like a couple. There's only like 2 or 3 Shakers left in the world.
Lehman Copley and the Shakers is what that chapter is called in Revelation.
Yeah. And
super good. Recommend.
Basically, there's a bunch of affidavits of people testifying that they saw an angel come down on the rooftop and handed their sacred roll and book to Ann Lee. And then another
Ann Lee,
one.
does she profess to be Jesus Christ in the form of a woman?
Yes.
I can't remember. So. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah. And then there could be examples such as the Virgin Mary, right, appearing to people. There's hundreds of different testimonies, maybe even thousands by now, of different people of the Catholic persuasion saying that the apparition of the Virgin Mary at Guadalupe in Egypt and Mexico is a testimony of the truthfulness of the Catholic Church. So I think these are kind of counter examples that are presented saying that, okay, like, yeah, you believe these witnesses, but why aren't you believing these witnesses? And that's kind of what he's hitting.
Say that Catholic part again.
So the Virgin Mary is a saint in the Catholic Church,
right?
And basically, I think legend holds that if the Virgin Mary appears to you, that's kind of a very strong spiritual experience.
Right.
It's a testimony of the authority and the truthfulness of the Vatican, right?
So
when these people,
yeah.
There's hundreds of testimonies of people that claim to have seen the apparition of the Virgin Mary.
But it's usually, and I can't really, I can speak from what I've heard, and I'd be happy to hear from other people, right? But from what I've usually seen, it's usually like during times of like natural disaster, or during times of like, the crops aren't growing and things like that, and you see the Virgin Mary's face in the dirt, or in the a way that something was like organized or fell over, and
like less physical.
Right.
Less clear.
Less physical.
Sure.
Right. So
that's why I think the strongest counterexample is going to be the Strangest, because it follows the same pattern. Like James Strange knew Joseph Smith. James Strange knew the story of the Book of Mormon, and then he's able to find plates. I think he has more than 11 witnesses, but he has dozens of witnesses, and they all follow him. And he translates ancient texts that he calls ancient. And we would say, as Latter-day Saints, would say that's probably a fraud. But I get it just seems so similar to the Joseph Smith story in some ways. Maybe that's the way that Jeremy Reynolds presented it. I don't know if there's more.
So I would like to that, and that's where I'm getting at, because when we first started making this CES kind of playlist, we were talking about, or the episodes, we were talking about the sincerity of the questions, and so he definitely poses this as like a very it's very strong. It's a very strong counter argument, but I am skeptical. I'd like to know more, and I'd like to see where it goes. And I have a preconceived idea that it stops in its tracks. And it's not something that's probably got a lot of water to it. Although it sounds like it does have a lot of water to it.
Yeah, and I think the Fair Mormon, some counterpoints is here. They said they had one of the witnesses who later confessed to helping fabricate the plates for James Strange.
One of Strange's? Okay.
Yeah, one of Strange's. That's what they claim. They had one who later denounced his project as a mere human invention. It took the better part of 10 years to complete his translation project. He had fewer plates in his possession, and there's not really a supernatural component to their witnesses. So it seems like the apologists are saying, like, yeah, like, okay, there is the similarities, but they're differentiating it by saying it's not as powerful. There's not this supernatural, experience surrounding it. And on top of that, what do you see now? Look at the Strangites, look at the Latter-day Saints. That's more of
organizational. Yeah, that's a good argument too. That's interesting. I'd like to know more about them.
Yeah. So I guess really, is that basically the gist?
That's kind of the thrust of it. So I would just say, like, he questions their worldview, he questions their credibility, their semantic differences, right? When people said they were seeing things back then, that was more imagination, maybe that was spiritual, were they actually seeing it? And then the counter examples of things that people wouldn't believe, and it wasn't a concrete, solid affidavit of where there's legal dates and they actually signed the paper and so forth. So
yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So I would just say, Jeremy Reynolds, if you ever end up watching this video, just from a philosophical stance, if you cut off their branch, you are also cutting off our branch, and I just don't think that's fair to me. I'd like to stay on my branch.
But are you saying like we shouldn't discount the Strangites?
We should discount the worldviews. We shouldn't.
I'll get back to the worldview discussion.
Oh, worldview. I thought you were talking about James Strange for a second.
Sorry.
I think they're still around. He probably could join them. Actually, on Reddit, I saw a few Strangites saying, "We're the real true church. Please pray about us," or something like that.
Hey, they got extra scriptures, and Mormons love extra scriptures.
We do. We love extra scriptures.
I'm going to make a concluding remark on this testimony thing. I think the real problem that the CES letter kind of unearths is that we as members never really talk about this stuff. All we do is we open up our Book of Mormon and we see 2 pages or whatever, a couple of pages that have the 3 witnesses and then the 8 witnesses. When we start learning about these details, like, hey, there's actually like the 3 witnesses didn't receive the witness at the same time. The 8 witnesses were like separated into groups. Some of them talk about spiritual eyes. Here's all these crazy worldviews that they had. Then we start to fear. Yeah, it's like, whoa, like what's going on here? I never heard about any of this stuff. It's the same pattern every time with church history. Right? It's like, whoa, what's going on here? We never talked about this. And then, but before that, all you hear that guy who like gets up in Sunday school and he's like, man, the 8 witnesses and 3 witnesses, they never discounted their testimony. That's the only thing you ever hear. So you're like, oh, wow, there must be like a super solid argument here. And I can believe the Book of Mormon's historical just on the basis of that. But then once all these arguments come in, you're like, whoa, it's way more complex than that. And then I think once you get through all of that, then you still have to admit, like, coming out, it's like, oh, actually, the witnesses are probably the strongest argument in favor of the physicality of the plates, So, like, it's kind of this cycle, you go in and then you come out. And say, hey,
so
what's called the naivete?
Want to comment on that? So, like, something interesting as well is, like, I think that each one of us has a moment or an experience that we know if we shared, it would devalue our credibility. But it's something that's still very, very clear to us, right? So, for example, like in my own life, when I was younger, I told you, Brandon, about it. I experimented with like sleep, and I wanted to know more about like lucid dreaming and things like that. Mm-hmm. And I had a very real experience of like sleep paralysis, and it happened twice. It's very real to me. But I know that if I kind of share that, kind of maybe out of context or something like that, then it's like, whoa, this guy is like a crazy, whatever. And so I think that because every person has a situation that's like that or multiple like that, then, you can always find something, some kind of worldview, some kind of experience that can be worked to devaluate their other experiences. And so, I just kind of want to put that out there and say that even us today, there are multiple things that can't be categorized in scientism or materialism, and it would definitely make us lose our credibility.
Yeah, I don't believe anything you say ever again, Andre.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. I wouldn't.
Just kidding.
You're just cutting off your own branch.
Brandon uses doTERRA oils.
You're cutting off your own branch. They're helpful for headaches, though, but I don't think they cure cancer. But I like to say, like, I think
psilocybin, doTERRA oil.
We'll get to spiritual experiences. There's an interesting entheogenic theory about the first vision.
Someone told me they used doTERRA oils for birth control. Okay, keep going.
Yeah. Interesting. No comment on that. I think people listening to this episode, some people are going to be really angry that we've been defending the witnesses. Other people are going to be like, yay, I have something to stand on. Like, here's the witnesses. I can ignore everything else. I think both of those views are kind of myopic. And so next podcast, we're going to talk about the archaeological evidence or lack thereof for the Book of Mormon's historicity. We're going to talk about DNA studies, and we're going to talk about what I think is probably the strongest argument against historicity, which would be the Deutero-Isaiah problem in the Book of Mormon and anachronisms. So stay tuned. We're going to hit up some more episodes. I think this series is going to go on for we're not even halfway done with the CES letter, but it's been interesting.